I'm joined by Christina Santos and Peter Howells, two of the main authors of Block 3. Christina, in Block 2, we discuss the different ways in which governments can run the economy and lead it to high equilibrium levels of output. What does Block 3 bring to this discussion?
Block 2 describes what governments can do when economies are stuck in low levels of output and very, very high unemployment rates. And when economies are facing these conditions, the priority is really to increase output. And what Block 2 covered was the increase in output through stimulating aggregate demand and just having supply matching this demand, because it did have this spare capacity in these resources just lurking, waiting to be used. Well, fortunately, economies are not always in such a terrible state. So when economies don't have this spare capacity lurking around, and actually the main problem with economies is not low output and high unemployment, often inflation becomes an issue that needs to come into play, and policy needs to balance issues between inflation and unemployment.
Peter, it seems as if there's some kind of trade-off going on between inflation and output.
Yes, there is, but we have to be a bit careful about the way in which we describe that trade-off. Basically, what Christina's been saying is that at very high levels of output or low levels of unemployment, there is likely to be pressure on output such that prices rise and rise continuously, so you have a situation of inflation. So indeed, there is this apparent relationship between the level of output or unemployment and the rate of inflation. This was formalised many years ago by an economist at LSE called Bill Phillips, who looked at two series of data. One was the rate of growth of money wages, and the other was the level of unemployment. And he looked at this data over the period 1861, I think, to 1957, and published the results in 1958. And what the data showed when it was plotted was a very striking message, very striking relationship between the two variables, an inverse relationship indeed, downward sloping in the diagram. So this was suggesting that at very high levels of unemployment, high levels of spare capacity, there'd be very little wage inflation. And this suggested that this was quite a reliable, convincing relationship. Behind it, I should say, there was also quite a basic and attractive idea, a bit of common sense, if you like, which was, well, if you had very high levels of unemployment, obviously Labour would be in a rather weak position from a wage bargaining point of view, and therefore couldn't negotiate very substantial increases in wages. So you had a very compelling combination, really, of data on the one hand and a sort of theory on the other, which rationalised this relationship. Unfortunately, this rather nice-looking relationship broke down rather dramatically towards the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s. In fact, if you tried to update the data in the 1970s, you couldn't actually put the observations on the same diagram. They lay so far off to the northeast that you couldn't get them anywhere near Phillips's original curve. So there was this quite dramatic breakdown. So there was the notion of a stable relationship, but we've had to move on a little bit further from that. So the trade-off is a bit more complicated than Phillips originally discovered.
And do we know why the relationship broke down in the 1970s?
Well, I think there are two things you have to look at in order to explain it. The first is the rather naive, perhaps, interpretation of full employment that we worked with at the time. By naive, I mean that there was a tendency to associate the notion of full employment with a particular level of recorded unemployment, obviously a fairly low level. Historically, I would say that was probably around about 3%. But actually, what constitutes full employment from an economic point of view is quite complex. It has to do with labour market clearing or labour market equilibrium, and that involves factors on the supply side like welfare benefits, and on the demand side like productivity. And changes in these things can cause the level of full employment to move around. And those conditions did change, and therefore what amounted to full employment became associated with a much higher level of recorded unemployment than it had previously been. So that's part of the explanation for the observations disappearing off into the northeast of the diagram. The other issue, I think, is expectations. So if we just go back to Phillips's curve again and we take some numbers, we take 4% unemployment. Phillips' data suggested that labour market conditions would be such that workers could expect to negotiate an increase in money wages of around about 2%, and employers would go along with that. But that's on the basis that the existing rate of inflation is actually zero. If you change that assumption, if, let's say, for the sake of argument, the rate of inflation that's embedded in the system when the negotiations take place is 5%, then workers and employers are going to expect that 5% to continue. So the negotiations, if you like, are going to start from a base of 5%. Then the labour market conditions kick in. And if it's the case that the labour market conditions are 4%, so you can negotiate a 2% increase, of course, that will go on top of the 5%. So the notion that there was some fixed rate of inflation that was going to be associated with a particular level of unemployment rather breaks down when you take account of this notion of expectations.
So if we look at inflation, what can governments do if the policies that we looked at in Block 2 don't work?
Well, I think there is actually a clue in Block 2, as Christina was saying earlier. And Block 2 is concerned with a situation where output is at a chronically low level, and therefore it's focused upon boosting aggregate demand to bring output up to a higher level, and presumably also to bring employment up to a higher level. And what I've just been describing is a situation whereby labour market conditions could emerge such that the pressure in the labour market is for higher money wages, and that, of course, is going to feed through to higher inflation. So if that's the problem, then Block 2 really is giving us a substantial hint as to what we should do, which effectively is to reduce the level of aggregate demand. And in terms of, again, if we can just refer back to Block 2, I mean, we can express this in terms of the IS curve. We raise interest rates, and that moves us up the IS curve. Output falls, employment falls, labour market conditions change against labour, and this reduces the degree of inflationary pressure.
Okay, so let me just try and sum up. I can see that when there is inflation, the policy response is to raise interest rates, and I can see that by doing that, that reduces spending in the economy. Demand goes down, firms produce less. But what about the labour market? What is the link between inflation and conditions in the labour market? Peter has already talked about wage negotiations.
You really identified one of the key mechanisms of this model. That IS curve gave you the relation between output and the interest rate. What happens is, to produce a certain level of output, firms have to employ a certain level of labour, certain level of employment. And that level of employment will actually determine how powerful workers are in wage negotiations. Because if unemployment levels are high, I, as a worker, might not have a lot of freedom to ask for high increases in my wage, because potentially my firm can actually go to the pool of unemployed people and find someone who might do a job just as good as mine, but who's willing to work for less than what I'm asking for. So high levels of unemployment usually put pressure on workers to just stay within relatively modest wage increases, and sometimes no increases at all. And that means in these cases, money wages increase by just a little bit, and often by less than inflation. That erodes real wages. But the opposite is also true. When we have very high levels of employment, the power shifts to the workers, who might then be able to ask for higher wage increases, actually nominal wage increases that might even be higher than inflation. So it seems that there is this point, a very natural point, at which the increases in nominal wage the workers are able to claim are exactly the same as the inflation rate. And this critical level of output is very important in our model. We call it the equilibrium level of output.
Peter, is it a question then of managing actual output so that it's kept as close as possible to what Christina has called the equilibrium output?
Broadly, yes. Strictly speaking, it depends what position the economy is in. If inflation is where you want it, then indeed what you just said is true, that what you try to do as a policymaker is to keep the actual level of output as close as you possibly can to that equilibrium level, because that corresponds to zero inflationary pressure, and everything should continue as it currently is. So if you're happy where you are, then you put your finger on it. That's exactly what you do. Of course, there will be occasions when you're not happy with the existing state of affairs. The policymaker may find that inflation is too high, in which case the procedure is, as I described it a bit earlier on in connection with the IS curve. You put interest rates up, aggregate demand falls, actual output, then is pushed down below the equilibrium level that we've just described. In the labour market, it becomes more difficult to negotiate money wage increases, and that puts downward pressure on the rate of inflation. So strictly speaking, the answer to your question depends on where you start from. But if you start with an inflation rate that you're happy with, then yes, the idea is to maintain actual output equal to equilibrium output. The difference between the two is something that's become known as the output gap in the literature. And the policymaker's job is to manage that output gap depending upon the current situation as regards the rate of inflation.
Yeah, you make it sound so simple. It's much more complicated than that in practice, no doubt.
The main source of the difficulties, I think, is time lags. What people don't appreciate is that it takes quite a long time for a change in the policy instrument, which is normally the rate of interest, to feed through to a change in the target, which is the rate of inflation. The first thing the change in interest rates has to do is affect the level of aggregate demand, and that takes, the Bank of England thinks anyway, anything up to a year. And then the change in the pressure of aggregate demand has to work its way through the labour market conditions to inflation, and we think that that takes the best part of another year. So you could be looking at anything up to 2 years between pulling the interest rate lever, perhaps is the best image, and getting a particular rate of inflation at the far end. And almost anything can happen in the space of 2 years. If you're trying to set interest rates today with a view to an outcome in 2 years' time, this places enormous demands on the quality of your forecasting. And we all know that forecasting economic developments is notoriously difficult. It places great demands on the quality of the data that you've got. I mean, if you are a forecaster and you're trying to forecast 2 years ahead, ideally what you want is the very latest data to put into your model in order to make the forecast. You don't want data that's already 6 months old. So there's a pressure to use the latest data. And we know that one of the problems there, of course, is that UK macroeconomic data is often subject to revisions. So you do your forecast on the basis of numbers that the ONS has given you, and then 3 months down the line, the ONS says, whoops, sorry, we rather overestimated this, or we underestimated that. So there are serious data problems, serious data demands. And of course, over time, this equilibrium level of output that Christina explained can change. And therefore, both sides, you've got a problem of managing the actual level of output, and at the same time, you're not absolutely sure what's happening to the equilibrium level that forms the other side of the output gap.
So this block really is economics in action. What's really interesting is that a lot of importance seems to be attached to economic theory and different models.
That's actually a very important point of the whole of economics. A lot of the debates we witness sometimes between should we balance the budget or should we increase public spending are really debates that are fully grounded in economic theory and in perceptions about where economies are relative to the theory. For example, as Peter was saying, where we are relative to the equilibrium level of output. If we are above, then potentially inflation is a threat and should be one of our main priorities to control it. If we're below, then by all means increase public spending. So a lot of the debates about running the economy are debates about economic theories.
Thank you very much.